everybody, and welcome to a new episode of the Future of Podcast. It's Vassie Papadopoulos here today. I am solo co-hosting. Azam is on vacation, but I have such a lovely guest that we didn't want to delay in terms of touching upon this topic and really getting into it for our viewers today. So without further ado, today's topic, and it's one that, given my background, I love to talk about. Can't wait to hear what our guest has to say. Today's guest is one of Canada's best-known political analysts. She's a thought leader, a strategist. I know she's fluently bilingual, both in English and French. She's written a couple of books, I believe, on this topic. She went to McGill University, first practiced law, and does a lot of teaching now, a lot of commentating, and is really, you probably have read her in the National Post. She has a column called My Opinion on Substack, and she was also named one of Canada's 100 most powerful women in media and communications by the Women's Executive Network. Today, we have with us Tasha Kheiriddin. So Tasha, welcome, and thank you so much. We have Tasha here with us today as we will be talking about the future of conservatism. All right, so welcome. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you, Vassie. Thank you so much.
Great, great. I'm so happy to have you here today. I know you, I would actually say you're an expert in this space. I can't wait to get into some of the topics around the future of conservatism with you, but maybe really to start off, just to give people a bit of flavor of your journey is, and I like to ask this to a lot of our guests, like, how did you get into politics? Like, what has drawn you to sort of commentating, analyzing, especially on a topic such as conservatism and the conservative movement? And really, like, what has been your journey sort of within this space over the last 20 years?
Okay, I'm going to try and condense this because we could talk the whole hour about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
I've had
a I have you for an hour, so we're good.
Yeah, I have a very, I would guess, non-traditional path to where I am. As you pointed out in your intro, I started off, I studied at McGill, I studied law, I was a lawyer, and that was, I thought, was going to be my, focus, law, then politics. How did I get into politics? Well, before the law piece, in high school, I ended up working on a campaign for Bob Layton, Jack Layton's dad, in Lachine-Lac-Saint-Louis, back in Montreal. I was 14 years old. And how it happened was somebody from my father's office was involved, and he said to my dad, do you want to get involved? It's 1984, and it was the big blue wave, and we were excited. My father said, well, I don't have time, but ask Tasha. She's got nothing to do. It's the summer. I was very interested in debating and issues, and I was very aware of current events and current affairs. I got involved in the campaign. We won, needless to say. It was a big victory for the Conservatives and for Mulroney, and it started me on the journey of finding my people. As I say to my daughter, who is completely different than me, she's an artist. She's artistic. She's found her people now in high school. She's at an arts high school. I'm so glad, because it took me till I was 14 to find my people outside of school in politics. And I realized that I was very engaged with the ideas. I was very interested in the policy side of things. I was also interested in the actual politics, the nitty gritty, the organizing on the ground, going door to door, giving out leaflets, all that retail stuff. I loved it, actually. It was fun. I met people, got to travel. I got elected to different executives as a youth, and I ended up being national president then in 1995, 7. I should remember this off the top of my head. But anyway, it was I already graduated from university. So I think it was 95. I enjoyed it very much because of all the challenges. Interest-wise, started reading more and understanding what conservatism really was, developing my own ideas. And then I stayed with it. I became a writer, actually, and I moved into journalism, first in broadcasting, when I was headhunted by CBC in 1998. And I ended up working on a television show, and that got me out of law and into television. I had been working in politics and law, but that made me make the move, and I got into TV with CBC. The show was called Counterspin. I worked on that, and then I ended up working for pretty much every network we have in Canada, CPAC, CTV, Global. I worked in radio, hosted shows, and it was very exciting to follow the journey of the Conservatives, but from a distance, because I was no longer involved in the party, obviously. And but I brought my analysis and my experience to bear in my analysis, and Radio Canada as well. And it's always fascinated me, and conservatism is dear to my heart because it is what I honestly believe is a worldview, gives the greatest, when it's properly applied anyway, the greatest possible outcome for the most possible people in terms of advancing opportunity and prosperity. So that's how I got to where I am today. There you go.
Wow, quite a journey. Now, you segued into it really well. Why don't we touch upon, I know, for some of our listeners, like what you would say conservatism is, or like how would you just define conservatism? And that would maybe, sort of the start of our conversation for today.
Sure. Conservatism to me, my conservatism is informed a lot by that of Edmund Burke, who was the grandfather of conservatism, or godfather, back in 1789 in the United Kingdom, or Britain as it was then, writing about in reaction to the revolution in France, which he saw with horror as an example of why, progress for progress sake, or just, wholesale destruction of institutions is not the best way to go about social change. So conservatism, first of all, is incremental. It's incremental in that it is not about revolution so much as it is about making small changes based on historical views. It's steeped in tradition. So a conservative will be a traditionalist. They will not simply just run blindly into the future. They'll look back and say what worked, what didn't, what informs our view. There's also a sense of sort of certain values are immutable, and these can be basic things: honesty, loyalty, trust. Democracies become sort of one of them. The idea of democratic are Democrats. They believe the government is a servant of the people. They believe that there's a certain tradition of noblesse oblige within conservatism that people who are up on the upper end of the income scale or upper end of power give back to. There's that piece. The Red Tory piece in Canada was informed by. So conservatism is really about, actually, in a nutshell, it's not the primacy of the individual per se. It is it's a bulwark against large government. Conservatives are not big government people. They believe the individual, the family, the little platoons of society, community groups, local government, decision-making is best when it's closest to the people that is being affected by. So to conservatives today, a conservative value is that kind of local view. It is about flexibility too. One policy doesn't fit all. It is about keeping government small to enable to limit its power to be autocratic and to dominate. So a conservative, for example, would prefer to have less regulation than more regulation. A conservative would prefer to have, and we see this, it's evolved to this point today, to have freer trade than to have too many restrictions on trade. Because we believe people should be able to empower themselves. But ultimately, it's about opportunity and equality of opportunity, not result. That's what distinguishes it from the left, where you want equality of result, which means that government will make choices to limit certain individuals' abilities, favor others, not based necessarily on ability, based on identity, based on opportunism for the government, what they think is best. So it's this opposite view, and equality of opportunity allows the individual to achieve what they can achieve, but not everyone's going to come up with the same result, right?
Right.
We believe there should be a similar starting place. They should all have an equal chance. And so that's really what distinguishes from the left, which is much more social engineering, and we're going to make everyone the same, essentially, almost forcibly so.
Yeah, that's probably one of the best ways I've heard that distinction being articulated or communicated, because I think sometimes people have a hard time in terms of describing, ideologies or movements like as conservatism versus liberal and so forth. So.
Well, there's lots of pillars too. I guess the thing too is that people will describe in different ways. I mean, there's certain pillars too, like conservatives believe more in law and order. They believe more in, I would say, like I said, traditional things, the family, faith, free enterprise. Those the 3 Fs they call them. And so that also leads to situations where they will not favor social change as quickly as a liberal. right? And liberals will say, well, that means you're going to stomp all over rights of people that aren't recognized. Conservatives may come to the recognition of those rights, but usually at a slower pace.
Right. So how about, what if we start at, conservatism started sort of with that Edmund Burke era. Where would you say the notion of conservatism falls now in like 2023?
Well, conservatism today, it's going to sound counterintuitive because in our country, conservatives are on the upswing in terms of polls. People call themselves conservatives.
Right.
What you're saying is not conservatism, it's populism. Conservatism and populism have had a relationship in Canadian history and in world history that is I won't say symbiotic, but very close many times, because there are certain elements that are in common, right? Populists often are also smaller government actors. They think the government's done something wrong. They're reacting against the establishment. They think it's gone beyond what it should be doing. Currently with Justin Trudeau, it spends too much. It has too many rules. So there's a commonality between the two. The difference is that populists tend to be reactionary or revolutionary. They push for change faster, and they often want to tear down institutions rather than deal with the ones that are there and simply reform them. So what you'll see, for example, you're seeing this in Canada, this idea of removing gatekeepers, right? Everyone's like, conservatives want to remove gatekeepers. So a true conservative would not necessarily use that language. That's more populist. It appeals to people who are disgruntled, who are unhappy, who economically have been left out. And this kind of fervor, I guess, this revolutionary fervor of like, let's just tear things down, right? And then what? We don't really know. A conservative would probably say, no, actually, we should reform things, but they would use different language. Conservatism today has been subsumed by populism around the world. We see it with Trump in the United States.
Yes, yeah.
In Brazil, Milei in Argentina, Meloni in Italy. Like, it is everywhere. The right, where conservatives sit politically, they're on the right, has become a populist haven because of economic downturn and insecurity and geopolitical insecurity as well. Whether it's over issues of immigration, of war, conflict in Ukraine, you name it, people feel insecure and they're looking for a strong leadership. And conservatives, like I said, you see them feed into this populist. It's easy for them to transit to that space, but it's not true conservatism the way a Burkean, for example, would paint it.
Yeah. And so what would you say, like, why have we seen that shift? Because I know, like, in 2003, it was sort of a watershed moment. You had the Reform Party that had come out of the West. You had the, Progressive Conservative Party. There was this big merger, like you said, of those on the right, formed what we know today as the modern day Conservative Party. So from let's say I think it was 2003 to today, like, that conservatism that you talk about has really, to your point, shifted to more populism than, the conservatism that you really defined at the beginning of the podcast. Like, what would you say why that shift has occurred? And do you think it'll continue on that sort of same trajectory?
It's occurred for economic reasons primarily. We've seen in Canada, and it's interesting because in Canada, we didn't actually have as much of a phenomenon as the United States. The US, really, after the 2008, 2009 recession, there are entire groups of people that have not recovered from that. That's the first cohort. Millennials who saw, their family incomes, in some cases, or their own incomes, depending where they were, really take a nosedive and not recover. The middle class in the US was very damaged by the recession. You also saw, second to that, the manufacturing base being hollowed out in the United States, outsourcing, offshoring, whatever you want to call it, of jobs. Entire industries in the United States. You think of steel, you think of cars, you think of any manufacturing of small goods. Like, where does Walmart buy their stuff? It's China, right? So jobs left. And those types of jobs, previously, you didn't need massive education to make a decent living. They are gone. So you had entire swaths of the American population that felt that things weren't working for them. They were being left behind. They're called the left behinds, in fact. And they're also, the difference is they're local versus global, right? So they are people who are rooted in place. Their jobs are in their factory town, their community. They're not the laptop class. They don't have necessarily professional qualifications or education that allows them to move anywhere and work anywhere, so that if things go badly in one place, they can go somewhere else and seek a better life. So these people felt trapped. You see them all around the world. I'm using the example of the US because that's where Trump really, like the first, I think, wave of populism was Brexit in the UK and in the US with Trump, and capitalized on that growing class dissatisfaction. So that's where it really started, the genesis of the sort of populism. But you see it in other places around the world too, where also similar economic issues have brought this to the fore. Canada, though, interestingly enough, was ticking along quite fine until Justin Trudeau took over in 2015. Our middle class, because we didn't have the same kind of collapse of the housing sector, was not actually in a bad place. Their income had actually gone up every year under Harper, even through that period from 2008 to 2015. The middle class was doing fine. But because the rest of the world, it wasn't, and particularly the US, the perception of people like Chrysler Freeland, who wrote a whole book about the US, by the way, plutocrats, was that something had to be done to save the middle class. Mm-hmm. And this is what Trudeau said. And he's still saying it today. He's right. Today, our middle class has been damaged, but it's actually been damaged partly by the policies that he put in. And I document that in my last book, was that how the way that they approached family policy, for example, redistribution, taxation, all these things actually hurt the middle class. They favored the lower class, took a lot of kids out of poverty at that end. They did. But the middle class actually saw their incomes go down. And then came the pandemic. So double whammy. There you had Canada's leave behinds, right? People who were in industries where they couldn't work because of rules, whether it was truckers, whether it was people with small businesses who couldn't keep them open, people who, were people who couldn't work in those businesses, hairdressers, restaurateurs, whatever. They suffered a lot. And the result was they became the leave behinds from this government. So the Conservative Party, which had been kind of ticking along and really not moving any radical direction under Harper, they weren't progressive conservative, but they weren't as far to the populist space as they are now at all. They moved into that space because it was there. It was vacant and it suddenly existed in this country. And that's where Poilievre capitalized on the whole truckers phenomenon in the protests in Ottawa, signed up all those people, and has changed the party fundamentally. The party is no longer the party it was. A lot of people who were in it are no longer active, no longer interested, and no longer feel welcome, quite frankly. And that is, I'm not sure how that will play out going forward in the long term, but in the short term, I think that's how the party is going to be. It is now the party that Poilievre has built, and it's going to stay that way for at least the next election.
Okay. All right, we're good. Okay. Oh God. So I actually, I wanted to get back to this idea. You were talking about the middle class. I'm really interested in this.
Yeah.
And how, you've said Justin Trudeau sort of made it a part of his platform, a part of really his ideology, how he got in. Would you not say, though, that the middle class has sort of continued to keep him in power? Like if we look at the pockets of how people vote and where people vote, and given all of these sort of economic changes, do you think that's going to change for voters and this sort of, demographic that we call middle class voters that will go maybe towards conservatism versus sort of, what maybe they've been offered the last few years?
You are seeing that in the polls. Definitely you're seeing it. And I think because things have got now worse for those people. They weren't worse before. Trudeau made them think that he was going to improve their lives further. Things like childcare, for example, that was a big promise a lot of middle class voters were interested in. He also he talked about pharmacare, but it never happened. There's dental care. There's lots of care things that this government's promised to do. The middle class, like I said, initially, I think Trudeau won because people were tired of the previous government. And the previous government made mistakes. In the election in 2015, they made mistakes around new Canadian voters. I've interviewed many of them for my book, and they talked about For the Right Path. They talked about this feeling that the Conservative government was not on their side, that it was prejudiced, even racist. There was the whole niqab controversy of the, snitch line for barbaric practices. So there was this anti-immigrant flavor that ran through it. So they didn't succeed with those voters and that middle class and that aspiring middle class. That seems to have changed now, and they're making a concerted effort to win over new Canadian voters. I said actually they should get 3 bases of voters if they want to win the next election and beyond, which is new Canadians, young people, and urbanites. Urbanites, not necessarily the core of cities, but the 905 belt, the sort of suburb, exurb population that you see, Mississauga, Toronto, Durham region, those places, for example. That's what they needed to focus on. And those are the bases that are actually now they're getting. And I think they're getting it for two reasons. One is people are sick of the liberals, honestly sick of them. Like any government, they've been there 3 mandates. It's a lot to ask for a fourth. But they've also, it's been very long. The pandemic feels like it's been 40 years instead of like
that's true.
Everyone's tired. They've been exposed to Trudeau in particular a lot more because of that. He was in their face like every day with press conferences for ages, and it was the truckers' sick situation, all that. So there's been a lot of stuff, a lot of in your face politics people are tired of too. But then there's also the fact that things have gotten worse for that middle class. So the middle class initially, I think, went along for the ride. They were like, okay, you'll make my life better, rock and roll, right? But now they're looking at it going, you haven't made my life better. My life's worse. My kids can't afford a house. Or even rent. Interest rates are sky high, even though that's not Trudeau's doing, right? Inflation isn't completely his doing either. There's inflation all over the world. But yes, did Canada spend too much? Did our government spend too much and contribute to that problem? 100%. So the decisions that have been made have really made the middle class angry. They feel let down. The promise was things would be better, and it's not. So they're looking at who else could offer them that. And while Poilievre doesn't have a lot of concrete stuff in the window, he's not Trudeau. So that's, I think, where the electorate is sitting right now. They're looking at it going, conservatism, okay, well, you give it a shot. And conservatives traditionally do better when economic issues are the issues that people are on the ballot. So if things hold with this trend right now for the next 2 years, which is a long time, mind you, then the Conservatives have a big chance, I think, of winning the next election.
Interesting. Now, what about, you talked about how conservatism has sort of moved more towards populism. I guess someone like you maybe doesn't feel the conservatism or the party of conservatism today in Canada necessarily represents you. Like, where do you think that larger tent of conservatives, and I use I think you use the terminology too, like red Tory, like where do you think the red Tories or this larger sort of conservative tent of people fall now? And do you think if you don't feel like you're part of that populist movement, where does conservatism go moving forward?
Yeah, it's the $100 million question of where does our politics go generally, and where do conservatives fit in? Because what we've seen in this country, like in around the world, in the US in particular, is a polarization. The liberals have gone very far to the left, and we haven't really touched on the culture issues, but they're part of it too. The sort of woke culture, embracing of interests and views that conservatives may not disagree with, but they feel that they're getting too much space. And the emphasis is being put on things that are not either serving them, or they feel it's getting too much attention versus other problems. And they don't like that. I mean, there is some racism, prejudice, and stuff like that on the right, 100%. There is, unfortunately, there is that. But there's also just a lot of people who are just tired. And they're like, well, why are we always talking about this? Like, can we not talk about something else? And thinking of for example, gender diversity and education in schools. It's a big issue. It was an issue at the Conservative Convention. It came up partly because people are just saying, well, why does this have so much space? We have all these other problems and things. So there's that emphasis that the Liberals have doubled down on those issues and rights of groups that have not gotten a lot of attention, and in some cases have faced a lot of prejudice. Think of Indigenous people, trans people, LGBTQ in general. The Liberals have been very strong on championing that, like the Democrats in the US, same kind of thing. But that has created a polarization on the culture front, just like on the economic front. You've seen one too. And that polarization has made it really hard for anyone in the middle, or anyone who's got shades of gray to their conversation, red Tories, Martin liberals, or business liberals, to have anything to say. Because the minute you say something, you're either one or the other. You're pigeonholed. And those people don't want to be pigeonholed. And they have moderate views on certain things. Their views are not easy to put in a box. I feel myself, I'm in one of those things. I'm a homeless conservative. Lots of people say that. I know homeless liberals. We all sort of look at each other and go, huh. There's a new party, the Canadian Future Party, which wants to capitalize on that. Middle, for example, they've just come out recently. I was involved, full disclosure, with Centerized Canadians, which was a precursor to that. I stepped away because, in part, I didn't feel like it was the right time to start another party. Because just from an analytical point of view, I look at this and go, it's not going to go anywhere at this stage. People are too in their little corners to actually come to that middle space.
Yeah. Oh, now
that's my life. I just collapsed.
That was so funny.
Sorry.
Okay.
Oh my God, this is so. Are you gonna cut that? You could.
That'll definitely be cut. Similar to my headphones that just decided to die on me.
Now I like just the.
And I have a good question too. Yeah, because actually I do want to get into this. So
my cat.
So based on that, like, how do you feel we address that? Because I think, you know, there's this perception or this understanding that, oh, the conservatism, the Conservative Party, it's so scary. You know, they can be very extreme. Or I guess what I would say is, you know, the people or the candidates or that they have out there, people feel, you know, there's probably not the majority or people or Canadians feel that, oh God, you know, there's this sense of extremism. They don't really represent me. It's all scary. And then to your point, I mean, you could say that on the other side too, and people go, oh my gosh, these are, you know, it's scary, crazy views, et cetera, et cetera. So what for me, I think about this a lot because I'm kind of like you. I want to have discussions around these topics and not always feel that everything is on fire, right? And I think most people want to take a reasonable approach. Like, how do you feel we get out of that, or are we going to stay in that spot because that's where the votes are and it's easy to, you know, trigger those types of sort of, you know, positions and then get people to vote for you?
I think that I fear we may be stuck in this for one more election cycle because we're facing an incumbent government. If the government had only been there for a mandate, maybe two, I'd say it's a bit different. But the government's been there a long time, and there's, I think, a deep resentment. You look at polling; it's like only 17% in the last. I think it was Angus Reid. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they said the last one that came out said that the government deserves to be reelected. Like it's less than 1 in 5, right? So the dissatisfaction, the feeling that, okay, you've had your run, time's up, is very strong. So that, I think, will make a lot of people hold their noses and go, okay, I'm not too sure about the Conservatives. I'm a bit extreme, whatever, all the stuff you said, but we'll vote for them anyway, because I really can't stand another, 4 years of Justin Trudeau. He's become an albatross for his party. I honestly do think that the problem is they have no one to step in, right? If they did have an heir apparent, I think it'd be a lot of pressure for him to leave, but he still has a hold on the party. There is no heir apparent, so they're kind of stuck too. But if people do that, then it's hard for the people that you're just describing who want to have that conversation, that nuance, to have it, because that will be swept away and people just saying, oh God, let's just move on to something else. And then we'll have this conversation. And I personally feel that that's kind of where we are. We're facing 2 more years probably of this government. There's no incentive for the NDP to bring them down. I mean, unless there's some kind of completely, huge Deus Ex Machina that comes out there and destroys the prime minister to the point where he has to quit, something like that. In which case there would still not be an election. It still means the party would still be there. So I don't see an early election being called. And so as a result, 2 years is a long time. It's actually, I think, favors the Liberals because things can change. The economy can turn around. Donald Trump could be the nominee and could get elected if he's not in jail in the US. And if that's the case, that is bad news for the Tories here, because he is such a lightning rod the Liberals will try and conflate the Conservatives in Canada with him. 100%. If I were their strategist, that's what I tell them to do. And I know that they're going to do it. And if they do that, then that will hurt Conservatives because, to your point, Canadians are not extreme people. Like, we really aren't. Traditionally, we are not. We've been liberal for a long time for a reason, because the Liberals are the mushy middle. right? They are a mushy middle, not a good middle, a mushy middle that sort of moves and shifts to whatever, people, whatever is going to get them elected. Their guiding star, their North Star is power. It is not like the Conservatives' North Star is smaller government, lower tax, like those. That's how the Liberals will say, oh, we're in favor of, rights and stuff, but their rights are positive rights, like rights to things as opposed to negative rights, like freedom of speech. That's a negative right. It's a right to not have it interfered with, right? Not a right to be able to do something or get funding or what, so it's frustrating. I don't know what else to say, Lassie. It's really frustrating.
Yeah.
Who want to have this deeper conversation. It's not.
We do. Yeah, I do. I mean, I do. Right. And because there are a lot of issues in Canada and in the world that deserve a nuanced discussion, like, or at least where it's not, it's always negative, and you just feel like it's always attack mode. And that's that can be very uncomfortable. I wanted to press upon, I know I've read quite a lot about this, and there's, been polling and research around it, around conservatism and women and women voters. You're a female, who is a conservative.
I identify as a woman.
As a and who votes conservative, supports the Conservative Party. But they say that, a lot of female voters, in the last few years have really shifted to the Liberals, and it makes it increasingly difficult for a party like the Conservative Party to get elected. Like, what do you say about that? And what do you think can be done to make conservatism more appealing to that Canadian female voter?
So female voters traditionally have been more on the left. And I think that is partly because economically they've been traditionally disadvantaged compared to men. And so they look, left-wing governments tend to promise you more stuff, to be very crude about it, but, promise you childcare and promise you dental care for your kids and promise you this and that. So if you're economically disadvantaged, you're more likely to say, okay, this is going to get me something if I vote that way. It's not that crude a calculation, but generally speaking, conservatives have also been seen as more traditional, and traditional things. Many of them have not been, favoring the emancipation of women, traditional rules and traditional patriarchal structures. So as a result, there are female conservatives for sure, but the vote overall, women tend to vote more liberal than they do, or left of center than they do right of center. That said, today I think they're actually not. There was a problem the Conservatives had last by-election in Mississauga, well, 2 by-elections ago. They really did not perform well with women. Women were saying they didn't like Pierre Poilievre, for example. Poilievre had a makeover, contact lenses, better hair. It's superficial. And I'm not saying women are superficial voters, but I think that they realize they're like, okay, well, we want to make you as appealing as possible. We don't want to make you scary or weird or, and so they're trying to make him look like more of a family guy with his wife and his kids and, warm and fuzzy. Like, all they're missing is a dog at this point. I don't think they have a dog. But, that's sort of, that is an attempt to, I think, soften the edges and to appeal to the female vote. But I think also on policies, a lot of women today, we all share the same issues that men do. No one can pay the bills. People who can't afford, rent or mortgages or this kind of thing. So that's a common, economic issues are common now to both genders. And so I think that is an appealing thing for women who are like, you know what? I just want someone who's going to help me afford, house and food for my kid. I'm not going to, if Trudeau's not doing that, well, I'll consider the alternative. So I think that they're making gains in part because things have gotten so bad.
Okay. And then maybe just to expand upon that as well, a lot of sort of the political dorks, when you really look at an electoral map in Canada, you look at the breakdown of votes and all of that, you can always surmise that most governments sort of win if you win enough ridings in what we call the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. And I think that's, you've seen that in the last few elections with the Liberal Party. What would you say needs to happen for the Conservative Party now to be able to shift, some of those ridings to kind of put them in that majority territory to form a federal government, let's say, next election?
So they have to appeal to those voters I mentioned earlier, specifically New Canadians who form the majority or close to in many of those ridings. If you think of Mississauga, for example, Brampton, Peel, go up to Vaughan, and then go over the other side to Durham region, where you know Ajax, Pickering, Whitby, all these areas that actually used to and Durham had fewer New Canadians, but now it's just as heavily populated as the western side, and so I think of Toronto. So I think that they have to appeal, and on that basis, I say there's a lot of places where they can appeal to New Canadian voters on issues that they have in common with them, which is one is entrepreneurship, seeking opportunity. You know, people who come to this country are not looking for a free lunch. You know, they want advantages. Sure, Canada's great, got a healthcare system that is, you know, in theory free. So, you know, there's things that sure they probably wanted here, but they also want a chance to succeed. And most importantly, see their kids succeed. So this is the piece that I think this is where I think it gets a little touchy with what they talk about, the anti-elitist conversation, right? You know, this bashing of elites all the time is, to me, it's a double-edged sword. It appeals to people who feel the elites have let them down. But New Canadians want their kids to be elite. Right? They didn't bring them up here to follow in their parents' footsteps. If their parents, for example, had to work as cleaners or had to work as Uber drivers or taxi drivers or work in hospitality because they couldn't get the job they were actually qualified for. You know, a lot of people are in that situation, and some don't have the education, but they want their kids to do better. They want their kids to be elite, quite frankly. They want them to be professionals. They want them to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, you name it. There's an aspirational goal there. So to bash elites all the time, to me, is a little dangerous, because you're essentially saying, well, you know, we don't like those top people, but then wait a minute, I want my kid to be a top. So like that, it's not, it rings hollow. It appeals to certain groups, but it could turn other groups off. Anyway, but besides that, I think that on the economic basis, Conservatives have to show that they can offer a better economic pathway forward for these groups. They can also connect on issues of family, the importance of family. You're seeing that with Poilievre and the way they're marketing him too. And I mean, he does have a family. So like, you know, it's not like they're lying, but Trudeau now is divorced, right? Or separated. What happened to his family? It blew up. I mean, there's a subtext there you could actually, I hate to say exploit, but you can use. Faith is another one. One of the pillars of conservatism under Edmund Burke, we didn't get into this too much, is religion. Now, it doesn't mean a specific religion. In fact, Edmund Burke in 1789 was a pluralist. He actually had a lot of good things to say about the Muslim faith. You know, people don't really know these things, but if you go back, religion, traditionally you think of Christian religion as conservative, you know, that's the worldview. It's not only that. It's more the notion that faith is an important part of your life. If you are a person of faith, that is valuable, that we allow you to practice. We give you freedom of religion. We're not going to interfere with it. And we respect that you have this sort of construct for yourself and your family. Like it's again, goes to a tradition, an idea of tradition, and not just simply progress at all costs, right? So that is an important touchstone. And I think that the Conservatives can definitely connect with New Canadian groups who are in the faith space. So those are lots of areas. There's lots of things they could do, Vassie. Yeah. And it's really a question of doing that groundwork, connecting and being in the community and having people, you know, see their face and shake their hand and say, hey, like, I'm like you, I will vote for you.
Yeah. And so do you see that reflected in conservatism today? And if not, like, you know, you talk about some of those tenets of, you know, Edmund Burke and, you know, the origins of conservatism. What would you say are those sort of key values you feel conservatism should have today, or should be reflected?
So key values, there's things, like I said, there's the family, faith, free enterprise sort of axis. There's equality of opportunity, not result. There's law and order, which is where, quite frankly, that was the breaking point for a lot of the red Tories that we talked about earlier, was the convoy. Okay, and myself included, I could not countenance the acceptance of like disorder just because you happen to agree with or use the perspective of the people that were in the streets for your own political purposes. Because frankly, crassly, that's what was done. Was capitalizing on this populist movement to win a leadership, to change the party, and potentially win an election. But it was done on the backs of breaking with one of the key principles of conservatism, which is law and order. And that's what a populist will do. It's not conservative. It's like populism is of the moment, right? It's what's the flavor of the day. The flavor of the day happens to be right of center, but it's not conservative. And to accept what happened in Ottawa, to say that was okay, to even today at the convention the Conservatives had, they continuously praised the truckers. No, that was a breaking point for a lot of people and cannot, like a bright line. I don't know if that line's going to get fuzzier over time as we move further away from the pandemic. But the Conservatives are still remembering it. They're still bringing it out. What they're now trying to do, and it's clever, they're trying to conflate, they're trying to recast the issue of the truckers' protest as government didn't listen to them, focusing on the fact Trudeau didn't meet with these people, dropped the war measure, the Emergency Measures Act on them. Yep. Yeah. So they're trying to say this was a case of government not listening. Not this was a case of people like blaring air horns all day and running riot and actually, harassing people. I personally know people who were harassed on the street by the protesters who weren't all warm and fuzzy and bouncy castles. It's a lie. They weren't. There was that, but there was also other stuff. And that piece of he wasn't listening. Now they're saying they're trying to conflate another group of people and say everyone who's been left behind economically, it's because he's not listening to you. He's disconnected from you. So the people who can't afford rent, can't afford housing, can't afford food, all those people, they're trying to sweep them into that tent and build a tent of the disaffected. And it's not just the truckers and the people who are anti-vax and those people, on that end. It's saying, hey, we have something in common with you. Guess what? Because he's not listening to you. So that's the theme they're running. It's clever. It's not conservative either, like I said, but it's clever. And I think they're trying to move away because they know that a lot of voters would be turned off by what they did in 2021 or 2022 rather, and those actions that they took. That for some people were just like, I can't go there. But they're trying to help get you to go there with this other stuff.
Yeah, but for you, it's really getting back to like the economics. You talked about the faith piece. You talked about law and order. That aspirational piece of people that want to do well, want to do better. Like that's where you really feel conservatism should really, really rest moving forward.
Yeah, I think there's a desire for better right now. People feel despair. A lot of them, you go to the grocery store and you're like, ugh, and even people who have good jobs and good finances and, aren't struggling, they also see this and makes you make different choices. I also, when I see how much food is at the grocery store, I'm just like, oh, I'm not buying that this week. Like, I just don't buy it. We haven't eaten a lot of steak around here. Like, it just doesn't happen because I just don't want to do it. No. And I mean, if I'm noticing the stuff, like a lot of people who are even in better situations than me also are saying like, it's expensive. Things are expensive and it's hard. And people who are at the lower end of the economic scale suffer the most. And that's where populism really takes root. It's historically the bad populism stuff that's really taken root has always been because people were suffering economically and they felt no one had their back. So they looked for someone who had their back, and that person doesn't have to have the magic solution. They just have to say what they want to hear and feel that they understand them. That's what we're seeing now is,
right.
I'm like you, I get it. He doesn't get it, I get it.
Right. But where does that leave room for like, I understand you, the others don't get you, here's what I'm going to do for you. Like, what do you think needs to be then done, to really address those issues and, in your point, really be that like a true conservative?
So a true conservative will want to provide equality of opportunity, right? So you look at it and say, okay, well, what is the problem right now? People can't put a roof over their head. That is a big problem, right? So conservatives it's interesting. They're throwing sort of the carrot and stick approach that Poilievre is using of like, we'll just deny money to municipalities when things don't get built fast enough. It's not really tackling one of the thorny issues of this. And one of the thorny issues is actually immigration policy. And this is where things get tricky because conservatives are often accused of being anti-immigrant, there's a racism element and all that stuff that unfortunately rears its head from time to time. And the conservatives want to stay away from that. And I agree they have to stay away from that. But at the same time, one of the root causes of housing shortage is too many people in too short a span of time. It's the time crunch, right? We can absorb a lot of people as a country. We can't absorb that many in that short of time, when coupled with shortages of materials to build houses, coming out of a pandemic, we have a worker shortage, all these, it's like a perfect storm of bad things, right? So you have to decide, are we going to create supply or are we going to cut demand? Well, a conservative would say, guess what? We should do both. We got to cut demand. We're going to bring fewer people into the country. And, you know, whether it's student visas or whatever, we're going to cut back because we have to absorb the people who are here first and figure this out. So I think they need to have a more holistic approach to housing policy than they have now. That's one thing. On the economy writ large, yeah, the government needs to rein in its spending, but it needs to rein it in a way that makes sense. They just announced they're going to cut $1 billion from D&D, defense. What the heck? Okay, we are in a situation of, global instability. Canada is not already doing its part in NATO. We've been asked to step up more. Cut, yes, but don't cut there. That's a bad place to cut. I think conservatives would do a better job to say we're going to prioritize policy and make cuts where it makes sense, as opposed to just cut across the board, which is what, So I think that they need to do that. And from a conservative perspective, again, it's about intelligent choices, right? And local primacy, changing the way things are done based on the people that are affected most. So if you look here, this is a national issue. Defense is a national issue. You cannot afford to mess around with that. Do not cut there. Other things, though, you can cut certain things. For example, fewer people are using transit. Guess why? Well, pandemic and work from home and all that. Right. So conservatives, liberals would be like, oh, let's spend money on transit. Conservatives would be wise to say, guess what? Actually, no. We need to look at this, look at smart spending on a local level. What do local municipalities say they need? What do they need? Let's talk to them. And not just throw money from Ottawa for transit because we think it sounds nice. Do we really need to build this stuff? Do we really need these, projects? Or is the money better spent on something else? Or should we not spend it at all? On certain policies like gun control, again, local primacy. Conservatives are in favor of freedom to, do a whole bunch of things. And we don't have the same as the US with freedom to carry guns. It's not in our constitution. But you can do this on a local primacy basis and say, okay, we have different gun rules for the rural areas versus the cities. Maybe in the city, you cannot have certain types of guns. You cannot have, whether it's not handguns or like large guns or hunting guns. You don't need hunting guns in the city anyway. But in rural areas, guess what? We're going to allow certain types of weapons because they are actually used for other purposes. And we're going to let them decide. We're not going to talk down to people. So there's a lot of room for creativity, I think, that conservatives could use on all these policy things. But we don't really know if they're going to do that because they haven't really come out with stuff yet. So we're still.
And I really, Tasha, I really like this notion you talk about local primacy. Really interesting. So really, it's really like really getting down to the local issues and really being able to solve them at that level. And that's really what Canadians or anybody really want, right?
And I didn't make this up. This goes back to Alexander de Tocqueville, right, in the 19th century, and the idea of Burke's little platoons of society, but also the local government. And in the US, it was very popular for a while as a concept. And I think that it's also a British concept too, right? I mean, this idea that local matters, and it's better to make those decisions close to people and not have direct top-down interference because you end up with better decisions. This is the other thing. It's not just about, a philosophy that for philosophy's sake. It's like, this is a better way of doing it. So I think that would be useful. It's useful in the government in a country like ours too, where you have a federation of provinces that never agree on anything. So, decentralization is also a conservative value.
Right. Now, what about the topic of, and you really haven't raised it, the topic of sort of the environment and climate. Because that seems to be, now you're like, that seems to be an issue that, does come up, especially for a younger generation of people where, it's an issue that people want. I feel like a lot of people don't understand it, but we know that, something needs to happen. And there are major environmental issues we need to address. Like where do you think this lands in terms of the Conservative Party today? Because I'm not always clear where the policy stands with them there.
So right now, polls show that people, like you said, think something should be done about climate. They're nervous, they're anxious, they see fires, floods, terrible weather. Yep. It's not good, right? So they're like, something should be done. But what? And previous polling, I remember the last in 2021 election, we did some polling. A firm I was at before, Navigator, we did polling and we looked at why do people re-elect the Liberal government? Climate was an issue because what it came down to there was that they believed that the Liberals cared about it. They didn't think they had all the answers, but they believed the Liberals actually cared about it. They cared about doing something. So better to elect someone who cares about it and will do something than someone who they didn't think. Because remember, the Conservatives had said they refused that resolution which had said that climate change is real. Well, that was also torqued by the media that, there was other things in that resolution they didn't agree with. But the point was that was the message that came out. So people said, okay, the Liberals care. I will vote Liberal for that reason. Today, climate has become, well, an economic issue because the Liberals' version of caring is the carbon tax. That's their big signature piece. So when Conservatives or people look at that, they say, well, okay, but I'm spending money on this and things are not getting better. Like, what are they doing with it? Why is this actually making a difference? Is it making a difference? Meanwhile, I can't afford groceries, rent, housing. You see where it goes. Polls show people want something done, but they don't want to pay for it. Poll after poll. Most people will not pay even $100 a year to fix climate. And we know that wouldn't even fix anything, right? And so I think that it's going to be less of an issue. I hate to say it, but I don't think climate as an issue will be the issue a winning issue for the Liberals. I think it actually is a winning issue for the Conservatives because they will say the tax is not the way to go. This carbon tax is going up and up and it's not completely rebated. So you are paying it. You're paying more for goods and services. How is this helping? It's not improving anything. And we don't think it will because the money is not going to, the idea is to use less carbon, right? Decarbonize electric vehicles and sort of thing. We're even seeing demand for electric vehicles in certain countries. I think Germany is like collapsing. Like people can't afford it. That's the problem. And electrification is a huge project. I think definitely moving away from fossil fuels in the long term as a species, we have to. I think we really do. But it's not something that will happen overnight. And it's not something that will happen with a carbon tax. It will happen when other things become cheaper by innovation. And that's what we need to work on. That's where the Conservatives, I think, need to put the emphasis. They are already doing that, to innovate and find replacements, but not, overnight, even by 2030, shut down the oil fields and this kind of rhetoric that you hear from the Liberals.
Right. So I guess the question on that, and this probably could be a whole total different podcast. I'm always curious, do you feel that there's a communications issue around climate? That people don't fundamentally, I think they see it, but they don't understand it. And it's hard to explain.
Yeah, there's a lot of disinformation. I mean, Canada's emissions are less than 2% of the world. It's like 1.3, 1.4, don't quote me exactly, but it's less than 2% in terms of global emissions. The big polluters are China and the US. China is building coal plants. They're coming online every day, right? Like 2 or 3 a week are coming online in China. They are not changing their pattern. They're changing some things because they realize that, their population is being affected by locally pollution and these kinds of health issues. But they are not sitting there being concerned for the rest of the world. That is not on their radar right now. So a lot of disinformation is that, oh, well, if I just change my habits here and I ban all the plastic bags, I'm going to save the world. No, you're not. It's like, it's tragic, but the efforts Canada makes will have a very, very minimal impact on the big issue, which is carbon emissions, right? So that's hard. It's hard for people to get their head around it. Local, I think that on the climate, it's not just climate. See, I reject the idea that environmental policy is all about climate. There's so many local things, again, local, that really matter. Pollution, whether it's airborne, waterborne, or soil, affect people in a very real and direct way. Like if you can't drink your water because it's polluted, if you are breathing in toxins and you get lung disease, that affects you more than climate writ large as a human being, as a person. And I think the Conservatives can emphasize that in terms of their environmental policy. It's consistent with what was done by Theodore Roosevelt in the US in the early part of the 20th century. This idea of conservatives as conservers of the land. conservers of what is tradition and good and valuable, and that includes forests and wetlands and farmland and all these things, that the idea that we preserve the land and stewards of that. And I think that resonates more with people than simply, you know, we will decarbonize, because you can also do things concretely, you know, whether it's preserving spaces or cleaning them up, or eliminating certain types of pollution on a local level, or polluter pays laws so that companies are not incentivized to discharge waste into the atmosphere or into the water. That affects people in a real way, and they can wrap their head around and go, yeah, I can swim in that creek now, and I couldn't swim in that creek 4 years ago, and that's a good thing, right? So I think that we need to pay attention to those things too, and not just get obsessed about climate change.
Preservers of the land.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes,
and
right.
stewards of the land, it's a very conservative value, frankly.
Yeah. Okay. I guess last question before we wrap up. You've got a crystal ball, and you're looking at the future of conservatism. Where do you, okay, maybe 20 years is too long, but 5 or 10 years, where do you think it lands? You know, does it stay within this idea of populism as you have defined it, or do you see it evolving and changing?
I would lie if I said I knew where it would go. I think in the short term, it will continue to be populist. By short term, I mean the next election cycle for us, and the next, you know, couple of election cycles, possibly globally, like, so 4 or 5 years. Most countries have elections, like, you know, if they have a stable system, 4 years or so. I think that there's flies in the ointment that we can't predict. I think war is one of them, and I'm only raising that because, you know, we have a war right now in Ukraine. That conflagration has not gotten any larger, but it's still ongoing. If we end up in a hot war with China, that will change things a lot. And there is that possibility. You know, China could, and most of you talk to people in defense and D&D in Canada and experts around the world, they predict within 2 years there will be hostilities with Taiwan. So that will change things. Because I think, again, for conservatives, you know, conservatism is not a reactionary philosophy. It's very much tradition, stay the course. So I think the right writ large in environments of conflict and war tends to do well, for sometimes for not good reasons, but because people want a strong leader, they're afraid. There's threats. So you see the right-wing movements in places like Hungary, in places like Slovakia, like they're rising. Why? Because people in those regions are feeling threatened. But they're not conservative, they are populist. So I think if the longer period of instability we have, the greater a chance that true conservatism, as we talk about it, will not come to the fore in the same way as populism will continue to rule the day. But I do believe that eventually pendulums, they always swing, right? And we'll get back to a place where conservative parties will be parties of conservative values as opposed to populist / conservative hybrids, which we have now.
Great. Okay. And we always like to ask our guests 2 fun questions before we wrap up. First one is interesting sort of streaming show that you're watching. Could be on Netflix, could be on, I don't know. There's so many streaming channels. I can't name them at this point in time. And then the second one is a good book that you've read that you would recommend.
Okay. So the streaming show I'm watching right now is Naruto. It is a very old show. It is streaming on Netflix. It is an anime series I'm watching with my daughter. It's from the 1990s. God help me.
Wow.
It's got like hundreds of episodes. We're only in the 2nd season. So I will say my streaming choices are pretty much always dictated by my family, as in her. And so that's what I'm watching right now. It's fun to watch, though. I like anime too. And it's interesting to see the themes of it, of, you know, loyalty, friendship, and fighting for what's right and all those good things. So I actually quite enjoy it. Book that I have read that I would recommend. I am currently reading a book, and I'm gonna massacre the author's name because it's not in front of me, and it is about it's Oleo, I think, Tafeki, if I'm not mistaken, and it is about decolonization in Africa. And and I'm trying to remember the title because I've left it and come back to it now, and I haven't read it in about a week. But it is an argument for why the current model of decolonization theory around Africa is not actually reflective of the situation. And the argument that Olefi, that's his last name, Olefi,
okay,
makes is that decolonization is actually a process that ends when colonists leave. And that after that, people make their own choices as to what cultural elements they want to assume, either from the colonizers in some cases, look at India, for example, but in Africa as well, places like Nigeria. He talks about the importance of not judging people or judging everything through a lens of colonization. He says, because then you reject everything that's been brought to the table. And he says that modernity is not the property of a colonizer. Modernity is what people want it to be. So if you want to choose to have a legal system that still has hangovers of British rule, it's okay if that's what you as a people legitimately choose. It's very interesting because if you apply it to other contexts like ours, which is why I'm reading it, we have a different situation because decolonization never really fully happened here. But you can still make that argument, I think, that modernity implies that you don't simply reject everything as bad if it was something that was brought in from the outside. So,
okay,
that's my long-winded way of saying I think we need to work again, find a middle way to work out these issues, and that's for me the good one.
I think that's the message of today. Thank you so much. This was really great, and today's episode was the future of conservatism.